Chapter 27 of Christianity in the Apostolic Age. Christianity in the Apostolic Age by George Purves. The Johannean period. The last third of the first century was in some respects a transitional period in the history of Christianity. The new religion had become firmly established. It was everywhere addressing itself to the task of maintaining the integrity of its belief and life against the hatred or seductions of the world, and of winning the world to its teachings. It had thus begun the struggle which was to last through the succeeding centuries. Within this period also appeared the beginning of those sects which dissented from the established faith or sought to combine it with alien elements derived from Judaism or paganism, while, on the other hand, the organization of the churches, at least in some quarters, advanced towards greater centralization of authority and compactness of form. These features of the Church's life continued to unfold in the post-apostolic age. Christianity, therefore, was already entering on the development and conflict to which as a world religion she was destined. At the same time, the apostolic age had not closed. All the elements which historically lay at the foundation of subsequent Christianity had not yet been given. This is shown by the fact that during this period are to be located the last ministry of the Apostle John and the writings which he issued. The latter entered so immediately into the life and faith of the Church that they plainly constituted part of its foundation, and together with the apostolic office of their author require us to extend the apostolic age practically to the close of the century. 306. During this period, Christianity continued to spread rapidly. Our information is scanty, but there can be no doubt about the fact. We have already noted its wide diffusion in the last years of Paul, section 262. That it entered Egypt with much power is proved by the remains of early Christian literature in that land from early in the 2nd century. There is also reason to believe that it entered Arabia and Parthia, and possibly India, as well as, in the west, Germany and Gaul. It touched Spain and perhaps Britain, while throughout the central parts of the empire it had its adherents in every country. The language of the Revelation, for example, chapter 7 verse 9, implies that the new faith included representatives from all nations. Clement of Rome, AD 96, refers to the apostles as preaching everywhere in city and country. Ignatius, AD 110, writes of bishops settled in the farthest parts of the earth. Pliny, governor of Bithynia and Pontus in AD 112, found the Christians so numerous that the worship of the temples had severely suffered. It is probable that by the close of the century companies of believers existed in all the larger cities and many of the smaller towns of the empire, and that the new religion was represented from the Atlantic to the Indus, and from Germany to Egypt and Arabia. Its strength lay in the cities. Early Christianity is known to us mainly by the names of city churches. The early post-apostolic letters, like most of those of the New Testament, were addressed to urban communities. In the Roman world, the city was the mistress of its surrounding district, and as Paul wisely chose cities for the sphere of his labors, so do they seem to have been generally the centers of Christian evangelism. These facts enable us to imagine the activity of the disciples either in formal missionary work or in incidental labors. It is a reasonable estimate that by the close of the century they numbered 100,000. 307. The Christians continued to attract also persons of very various positions in life. Undoubtedly, most of them still belonged to the humbler classes, but there are indications that people of wealth and occasionally some of high social standing had enrolled themselves among the followers of Jesus. Already Paul had found it necessary to warn the rich against the love of money. 1 Timothy 6, verses 9, 10, 17-19. And again, much later, the church at Laodicea was reproved for trust in riches. Revelation 3:17. Toward the close of Domitian's reign, his own cousin, Flavius Clemens, was executed, and the latter's wife, Domitilla, banished for sacrilege, and the evidence is conclusive that they were really Christians. The Coemeterium Domitille was one of the earliest Roman catacombs, and by its name confers the inference, which may be drawn from the vague statements of secular historians, that Christianity had penetrated into the imperial family itself. Such instances no doubt were rare, but they warn us against supposing that all of the believers were of the lower orders. The fact also that philosophic influences tended, as we shall see, to corrupt the faith indicates that many belonged to the educated class. 308. The worship of the Christians was still of the simplest kind. The first day of the week, already called the Lord's Day, Revelation 1:10, was the one for formal gatherings. Early in the 2nd century we find its observance rather than the Jewish Sabbath noted as the distinguishing mark of the Christian. Justin Martyr's description of the simple service, the reading of the memoirs of the apostles and the writings of the prophets, an exhortation by the presiding officer, and the celebration of the Eucharist, will doubtless apply to the close of the 1st century as well as to 50 years later. Traces of the beginnings of liturgies and of Christian hymns may indeed be found in Clement of Rome, AD 96, and the teaching of the apostles, AD 100, the latter also in the Pauline epistles themselves, Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 4:16, 1 Timothy 3:16. And we probably should conceive of the public worship of this period as in a state of transition from the spontaneous exercise of spiritual gifts, such as is described in Paul's epistle to the Corinthians, to the more formal service of later times. But it was still a simple service. The 2 rites of baptism and the Lord's Supper were the only obligatory ceremonies. The latter was still connected with the agape or love feast, and was usually celebrated in the evening. The meeting places must still have been commonly private houses. 309. There appears also to have been advancing, at least in some quarters, a decided modification of the organization of the churches. The Christian community in each locality had been governed originally by a body of equal presbyter bishops, after the model of the synagogue. But at the end of the century, a single ruler appears in the churches of Asia, called by preeminence the bishop. Assisted by his corps of presbyters, he was in charge of the administrative and executive work of the church. Compare Epistles of Ignatius and perhaps Revelation chapter 2 verses 1 and 8, etc. Since in the earlier period bishop and presbyter denoted the same office, the later form of arrangement must have developed out of the former by the elevation of one to the position of permanent president. This centralizing process advanced, however, unequally in different places. It was more advanced in the East than in the West. At the close of the century it can be affirmed positively only of the churches of Asia. Yet the drift towards it must have been general. It was, in fact, a natural movement in the interest of efficiency of organization and unity of life. The church in each locality constituted one body, whether it had one meeting place or several. Over the whole the body of presbyters had presided, and when out of their number a permanent bishop was chosen, he still officiated as the head of the same local community. There is no evidence that these communities were united in an external organization, but only by their common faith and mutual love, and the common recognition of apostolic authority. Compare 3 John 10, Revelation 1:11. Neither had the priestly conception been attached to the governing officials, and while the local ministry of rulers and teachers and deacons existed everywhere, there were also traveling missionaries and evangelists who went from place to place bearing the word of the Lord. 3 John verses 6 and 7, compare to the teaching of the apostles 11 to 13. The condition of affairs was thus transitional and varied, but a tendency towards increasing compactness of organization and toward the visible expression of the unity of the several churches in the person of a single chief ruler can be plainly discerned. 310. Of the causes which led to this, one of the most potent was the spread of false teaching among the churches. This was certainly the motive which led Ignatius, AD 110, to emphasize the duty of loyalty to the established offices and services of the churches which he addressed. The existence of this peril, which had already appeared in the time of Paul and Peter, is evidenced by the writings of John. The fourth Gospel was written confessedly with an apologetic purpose, chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, and its prologue as well as its general contents indicate that the apostles felt forced to proclaim the true doctrine of the divine human personality of Jesus. His epistles contain references to the same class of errorists: 1 John chapter 2 verses 18, 19 and 22, chapter 4 verses 1 and 3, chapter 5 verse 6, 2 John verses 7, 9 to 11, 3 John verse 4. The Revelation denounces other false teachers: chapter 2 verses 2, 6, 14, 15, 20 to 24. Some of whom, as the Nicolaitans, appear to have combined gross immorality with their erroneous teaching. We know also from later writers that toward the close of the century a certain Corinthus came from Alexandria to Asia. He combined a type of speculative Judaism with Christianity. To him, Jesus was a man on whom the Spirit of the Christ descended at his baptism and left him before his death. His theology was controlled by the notion that God himself cannot come into immediate contact with matter. Hence, intermediate beings were necessary to account for the origin and government of the world, and the idea of a real incarnation and of redemption by sacrifice vanished in the speculations of philosophy. This was one of the earliest forms of Gnosticism, and it is not improbable that some of John's expressions were directed specifically against this teaching. For example, 1 John chapter 2 verse 22, chapter 4 verse 2, chapter 5 verse 6. On the other hand, sections of the Jewish Christians who survived the fall of Jerusalem drifted into settled antagonism to the established Gentile Christianity. In some cases their Judaism was more potent than their Christianity, so that the latter became little more than nominal. They considered Jesus as only a man, and continued to regard the Mosaic law as necessary. They were afterwards known as Ebionites. Others of the Jewish Christians did not relapse so far, but still kept aloof from the established Gentile churches, while still others strove to introduce eclectic combinations of Jewish or Christian ideas, or both of these, with philosophic elements. Thus Christianity was being seriously threatened in her beliefs, and the fact naturally led her leaders to emphasize the duty of fidelity to the existing organizations and to their authorized teachers. 311. On the other hand, they felt with increasing force the universal enmity of the outside world. In fact, the new religion now stood face to face with a hostile society and a frowning empire. Two great events had helped to produce this situation. The fall of Jerusalem, AD 70, had finally destroyed the cradle of the faith. There could no longer be a double Christianity, a Judaic and a Gentile. It was Gentile alone. Most of the Jewish Christians merged into the Gentile churches, while those who remained outside dwindled, as observed above, into dissenting and heretical sects. Christianity thus became completely separated from Judaism, and as a religion without a country was forced to her world mission. Then further, Nero's persecution had placed the ban of the empire on the Christians in distinction from the Jews. His policy was continued by the Flavian emperors, and though we have no record of the further persecution until the reign of Domitian, there is little ground for doubt that Christianity was officially regarded as illegal. In the later years of Domitian, actual and violent persecution was waged. The emperor suspected that Christianity was a treasonable movement, and in both Rome and the provinces many were imprisoned or slain. The attitude of the government could indeed hardly have been different so soon as Christianity was distinguished from Judaism. No religion was tolerated by Roman law which was not that of a subject nation, and under the empire societies of all kinds were regarded as dangerous to the state and allowed only under special licenses. Meanwhile, popular hatred was increasing on account of the refusal of the Christians to recognize the pagan gods and to worship the emperor, a refusal which seemed sure proof of atheism and disloyalty. This gave plausibility also to the vulgar rumors that they were immoral and inhuman. Popular hatred thus supported governmental oppression. It was evident that Christianity had truly entered on a world conflict. The fact at once intensified its consciousness of its mission and the need of unity for the struggle. This is illustrated by the antithesis between Christianity and the world, which appears constantly in the writings of John. 312. Finally, with this widened environment, Christianity naturally felt as never before the influence of the intellectual, social, and political ideas which were current in the empire. As already remarked, heresies of an eclectic character began to appear. These, however, were but special manifestations of the larger fact that the new religion was exposed to the subtle operation of the forces dominant about her, and which threatened to impair her independence and integrity. It was preeminently an eclectic age, and Christianity was possessed of so much moral and intellectual vigor that she easily formed a new center about which ideas gathered which were alien to her nature and detrimental to her proper progress. In the next century we find her heavily weighted by notions derived from pagan or Alexandrian systems and affected by the institutions of Greek or Roman society. These influences doubtless began to operate before the Apostolic Age had closed. Many of the Gentile converts must have failed to understand the Hebrew presuppositions upon which the new religion rested. A new class of problems were necessarily suggested by contact and conflict with universal paganism. Current philosophical and social ideas had to be met and mastered. Christianity was now grappling with the whole world problem and needed to understand herself and her mission in the light of the enlarged sphere in which her subsequent history was to be enacted. It is this situation which gives historical interest to the writings of the Apostle John. 313. Nothing is related in the New Testament of the life of John after the council at Jerusalem, Galatians 2:9, until we find him on the island of Patmos, an exile for his faith, Revelation 1:9, and addressing the revelation to the 7 churches of Asia. So far as it goes, however, this evidence agrees with the tradition that he passed the last years of his life in Ephesus, was thence banished to Patmos by Domitian, returned to Ephesus after the emperor's death, and survived till the time of Trajan, AD 98. The tradition was early and widespread. It was also direct, for it is most explicitly stated by Irenaeus, whose teacher, Polycarp of Smyrna, was a disciple of John. The banishment to Patmos was assigned by most other authorities also to the time of Domitian, and it is quite impossible to conceive of the advanced condition of the Asian churches described in Revelation as existing under an earlier emperor. We cannot say definitely when John left Jerusalem. It is perhaps the most probable view that he remained in Palestine until the approach of the war with Rome. It may be, however, that he had gone elsewhere before that time. Certainly he is not mentioned in connection with Paul's last visit to Jerusalem, Acts 21:18. Since also no reference to him occurs in the pastoral epistles, nor in those of Peter, we may believe that he did not settle in Asia until after AD 70. 314. It is not surprising that John selected Ephesus for his last residence in view of the importance of that city and the influence which the Ephesian church had exercised from the beginning of its history. Section 211. There he was in the very center of Eastern Christianity. That he wielded great influence is attested not only by tradition but by the authoritative tone of his writings. For example, John 21:24, 1 John 1 verses 1-3, chapter 2 verse 24, chapter 4 verse 26, chapter 5 verse 13, Revelation 1 verses 1-3, and their immediate circulation in the churches. He was not, indeed, the only one in that region who had been a personal disciple of Jesus. Early tradition relates that at one time Andrew was there with him, and not far off, in Phrygian Hierapolis, lived Philip, though the notices of the latter seem to confuse the apostle and the evangelist of that name. There was also at Ephesus a certain Aristian, who appears to have been an aged and venerated disciple, and around the apostle there seems to have gathered a circle of prominent Christians, some of whom probably had long been believers. But it was John who left the chief mark on the place and time. Interesting stories concerning his life and personality floated down the stream of tradition. We are on sure ground, however, only when we interpret his own writings. 315. The fourth Gospel had for its avowed purpose to prove that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing ye may have life in his name. Chapter 20, verse 31, Revised Version. It does this by giving certain discourses of Jesus not found in the Synoptics, in which the Lord bore witness to his unique relation to God, the world, and his disciples. The Apostle also gives a number of historical incidents bearing on the same theme, at most of which he had himself been present. We are concerned, however, only to note the light thrown by this work on the last years of the Apostolic Age. Its prologue gives the key to the situation. Here Jesus is presented as the incarnation of the divine Logos, Word of God. This indicates that the author was confronted by speculative theories concerning the person of Christ, which he felt it necessary to refute. The term Logos had both a Hebrew and a Greek pedigree and would be recognized both by Jew and Gentile, and especially by those touched by the eclecticism of Alexandria, as a fit phrase by which to describe the founder of Christianity as the personal and perfect revelation of God. The Apostle, however, did not subordinate his teaching to current philosophic notions. In his description of the Logos, he only repeated ideas which had been taught in other terms by earlier Christian teachers. See, for example, Colossians 1, 13-20, chapter 2, verse 9, Philippians 2, verses 5-11, Hebrews 1, verses 2-4. He unites this teaching into one great representation in which, starting with the eternal personality and divinity of the Logos, he traced his revelation of God in nature, in humanity, and finally in the Incarnation. Of this theme the Gospel which followed was intended to be proof. Thus John showed that because of his real divinity, Jesus was the perfect revelation of God, and further that his Incarnation was the crown of that manifestation of God, which from the beginning of time he had been making throughout the universe. It was through him alone that men had ever known God at all, and in his coming in the flesh, and in the religion which he had thus established, the final and complete disclosure of God, truth and duty had been effected. It must be evident that the publication of this conception of Christ and of Christianity marks the highest point possible in the claim which the new religion could make for itself, that thus it was prepared as the only true religion to demand acceptance by all mankind. Whatever of truth or duty might exist elsewhere found its synthesis in the personal revelation of the divine Word himself. 316. The first epistle of John stands in close connection with his Gospel. It is, in fact, intelligible only to readers of the Gospel, and was probably issued with or shortly after it. It is the application to Christian life of the conception of Christianity as the perfect revelation of God. It was written, the Apostle says, on the basis of that manifestation of life contained in the incarnation of the Logos, which the Apostles, by their association with Jesus, were qualified to declare, chapter 1, verses 1-4. In the revelation of God as light, i.e. as the embodiment of rational and moral truth, is to be found the determining factor of Christian knowledge and life, chapter 1, verse 5 to chapter 2, verse 6, whereby the believer is necessarily separated from the world and error, chapter 2, verses 7-27. Since also the fullness of this truth and life will be manifested at the second coming of Christ, it is necessary that the sons of God should show righteousness, which is the evidence of sonship, by obedience and love, chapter 2, verse 28 to chapter 3, verse 24. And the proof that they possess the divine Spirit is their true confession of Christ, adherence to revealed teaching, and the love which is the soul's response to him who is in his own nature love, chapter 4. We are next reminded that faith in the revealed Christ is the condition of the whole spiritual life wherein the world is overcome, chapter 5, verses 1-12, and the epistle closes with a statement of its purpose, that ye may know that ye have eternal life, ye that believe in the name of the Son of God, chapter 5, verse 13, Revised Version, compare John, chapter 20, verse 31, and with a summary of the certitudes given in Christian experience, whereby we may rest confidently on the faith which led to them. Even this general outline of the epistle shows that to John Christianity was the absolute revelation of God, and the establishment in the soul of the genuine life in and with God. Thus its universality appeared in its absoluteness. With Paul, its universality had appeared in its unlimited scope and applicability. In the Epistle to the Hebrews, in its being the final goal of Hebrew revelation, with Peter in its fulfillment of the prophetic hope of Israel, but to John in its being the perfect revelation of the religious realities, of the idea of religion itself. The apostle by no means resolved it into a speculative system. He remained true to the historical facts, but the profound significance of the facts had unfolded in accordance with the historical situation, and when Christianity found itself confronted by the world, it asserted itself in the writings of John to be, from its very nature, and because of the person of its founder, the world's only real religion. 317. The second and third epistles of John throw interesting light on the apostle's care of the churches. They are unmistakably Johannean, though the writer, quite in accord with his reserve in the Gospel and first epistle, calls himself simply the elder. The second epistle was addressed to the elect lady and her children, by which we probably should understand a church rather than an individual, because of the following reference to certain of her children, verse 4, Revised Version, and to the directions against false doctrine, verses 7 to 11. It is a brief note, perhaps carried back by some of the members of the church who had been at Ephesus, verse 4, urging to a life of love and warning against the same class of false teachers mentioned in the first epistle. Compare 2 John verse 7 and 1 John chapter 2 verses 18 and 22 and chapter 4 verse 2. The true Christian, he says, will abide in the teaching of Christ, verse 9, and the errorist should by no means be received to the church's hospitality, verse 10. The third epistle is still more illustrative of the times. It was addressed to Gaius, a prominent member of some church, commending certain missionaries on their way to another place, of whom Demetrius, who is specially commended, verse 12, was probably one. We also learn that in the church to which Gaius belonged, a certain Diotrephes had refused to receive missionaries sent by John with a previous letter, and had expelled those who did receive them. Diotrephes was doubtless a presbyter, possibly a presiding bishop, but his power was apparently more personal than official, verse 9. In both letters John expressed the hope of visiting his correspondents shortly, and against Diotrephes he threatened the summary exercise of apostolic authority. We thus see the apostle's vigorous oversight of the churches, as well as the factious and false teaching against which he had to contend. The allusion to travelling missionaries shows also the efforts made to propagate the faith. In the Teaching of the Apostles, AD 100, we read of similar evangelists, there called apostles and prophets. The enthusiasm of missions was in fact so great that it was necessary to test the teaching and character of these itinerants, since false emissaries caught the zeal and divided the work. We can thus realize the practical difficulties of the times, even as John's larger works illustrate the greater problems of thought and life with which he dealt. 318. Finally, in the Revelation we are introduced to an entirely different kind of literature from any yet brought before us. Apocalyptic books were not strange in those days. Later Judaism, moved by the still earlier book of Daniel, produced a number of such works. Their authors, however, generally imputed them, as in the case of the book of Enoch and the Assumption of Moses, to some one of the older patriarchs. These books excited a powerful influence on the thought and hopes of the Jewish people. Their characteristic was the representation of ideas or of future events by symbolic figures or actions. It was a favorite form of literature and adapted to times of storm and stress. The wonder is that Christianity did not produce more such works, and it is a testimony to the truly prophetic character of John that he did not, like the Jewish writers, attach his apocalypse to the name of an older prophet, but issued it in his own name. 319. This book describes itself as Christ's revelation of the future communicated symbolically to John, chapter 1, verses 1 to 3. It is addressed to the 7 churches of Asia, chapter 1, verses 4 to 6, and its general subject is the coming of Christ to judgment on the enemies of God and for the salvation of his people. It consists of 7 visions, or series of visions, which represent as many aspects of the triumph of the enthroned Lord. We are again concerned only to note its bearing on the mind and situation of the church. the opening messages of the churches furnish some interesting facts. 5 of these churches are here mentioned for the first time, yet evidently they had all been long established. That of Ephesus still appears as the foremost in the whole province, and the references to various types of heresy, chapter 2, verses 6, 14, 15, 20-24, to persecution, chapter 2, verses 10 and 13, chapter 3, verse 10, to the enmity of the Jews, chapter 2, verse 9, chapter 3, verse 9, together with the careful discrimination of the spiritual conditions of the several communities, give a graphic picture of the situation which existed in Asia. Taking the book as a whole, it is evident that the return of Christ was still the Church's hope. It was not conceived, however, as an isolated event. It was, in fact, inclusive of a large and varied series of events which would lead up to it. All these were regarded as the appointed unfolding of God's decree, and over the whole process the enthroned Redeemer King is himself presiding. That process would consist in Christ's progressive triumph, partly by proclamation of the gospel, and partly by judgment on a wicked world. The latter aspect is very prominent, as was natural in a time of the Church's feebleness and distress. The future was expected also to be a period of conflict. The power of evil would be arrayed against the Church, and deadly apostasy would arise within her. Yet the redeemed people of God would be safe, their prayers for succor would be answered, their final salvation was secure. And this not only for them as individuals. The book contemplates the conflicts, perils, and final establishment of the Church as a body. The 7 churches of Asia were representative of the Church universal, and the New Jerusalem was the visible embodiment of her ideal state. All this is depicted by means of symbols which denote principles and ideas rather than special individuals. 320. Thus in Revelation, as in John's Gospel and First Epistle, the consciousness of a world conflict, a world process, and a world triumph is manifest. The return of Jesus is contemplated in relation to the enlarged environment in which Christianity stood. Revelation testifies to the persistence of the hope with which Christianity had begun, but also to the fact that into that hope had entered the fuller conception of Christ and his salvation which the apostles had taught, and the broadened vision of the purpose of God which the history had made clear. Yet it was still the same hope, "Behold, he cometh," Revelation 1:7, and the prayer was still the same, "Come, Lord Jesus," Revelation 22, verse 20. 321. With the Johannean literature, the Apostolic Age closed. It is true, as already observed, that the last part of the century was transitional, and we have at least one production, nearly contemporaneous with Revelation, which really belongs to the post-apostolic period. This is the Epistle of Clement, written in the name of the Church at Rome to that at Corinth, AD 96. The pseudo-epistle of Barnabas and the teaching of the apostles have also been dated by some scholars, but with less probability, in the 1st century. But the student of early Christian literature must recognize that these works are on a lower level, that their authors were sensible of dependence on those of the Apostolic Age, and that with them we pass out of the originative period of Christianity. In the writings of John, the foundation of the new religion was completed. It would be erroneous, indeed, to imagine that all or even most of the converts fully appropriated the teaching of the founders of the Church. The literary remains of the next generation show that the Church failed to grasp many of the doctrines taught in the former age, and the progress of subsequent Christianity, viewed internally, often reveals a slow and inadequate apprehension of the apostolic faith. This, however, only illustrates the unique and fundamental character of the apostolic instruction itself. On the other hand, the historian must perceive that the literature of the apostolic period combines with the historical movement in which the original faith in Jesus as Messiah unfolded its contents and expanded the area of its influence to present an intellectual and moral unity which was plainly the work of one Spirit, completing harmoniously the presentation to men of the mission and message of Jesus, and thus providing a foundation on which subsequent Christianity was intended to build. It is the fact of this unity which gives its supreme importance to the history of the Apostolic Age, for it certifies that apostolic Christianity was the normal and authoritative exposition of the religion of Jesus. End of section 27. End of Christianity in the Apostolic Age by George Purves.